It's the week ending Saturday, the 13th of July, and this is The Week Unwrapped. In the past 7 days, we've seen the UK's American ambassador resigning after pressure from Donald Trump, a BBC documentary further highlighting the issue of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and a Japanese space probe touching down on an asteroid. But we're here to bring you some stories that passed under the radar this week. Big news not making headlines right now, but with repercussions for all our lives. I'm Olly Mann, and let's unwrap the week. And joining me today from the Week's digital team, we have Kari Wilkin. From our sister site, theweek.com, it's the return of Jessica Hullinger. And from The Week Junior, we welcome back their editor supreme, Felicity Capon. And starting the show this week, it's Kari. What do you think this week should be remembered for?
I think it's the week we asked, have we really learned our lesson about asbestos?
If we had young children who were dying while they were at school, everybody would know about it. But because it takes so long to show itself, it's forgotten and hidden and a secret.
That was Sarah Stoddard talking about asbestos to the NUT Union in 2017. She died in 2018. Kari, remind us what happened to Sarah.
Well, she was a primary school teacher for 30 years, and then she contracted a cancer called mesothelioma, which is a cancer of the lungs, which is almost exclusively caused by asbestos. And she traces this back to her time working in a primary school that contained asbestos. And this is in the headlines this week because almost 700 schools in England had been referred for inspections by the Health and Safety Executive over concerns that they're not properly managing asbestos in their buildings, in quote, in line with regulatory requirements. So, and this has raised concerns that potentially thousands of staff and pupils could be at risk.
Well, of course, that is concerning, especially for historical cases. But could you twist this as a good news story in the sense that they are now being reported and referred? I mean, the headline is people have noticed.
No, well, the problem is there's no statutory duty on schools to report their asbestos management. So these are all guesstimates. The government last year launched an asbestos management assurance process to find out just what the situation is in schools. So they sent out surveys to 3,000 schools, of which 87% reported asbestos in at least of those. 87% of those that responded reported asbestos in at least one of their buildings, and it's estimated that up to 90% of school buildings in England contain asbestos, around pipes and boilers and in walls and ceiling tiles. But these are all guesstimates, and there's no concrete figures. There's no requirement for schools to declare if there's asbestos in the buildings. And more worrying still, the National Education Union says that they've researched this and found that most teachers in these schools, if they're told it's there at all, don't know where it is. So it's just, it's very easy to disturb, despite what the government says to the contrary. So all it takes is a pin in a wall or a broken ceiling tile, and you've disturbed these potentially lethal fibres, and even low levels of exposure can cause this cancer.
And Felicity, hearing that it's in schools concentrates minds, doesn't it? But this is actually a problem that's broader than just schools.
Yeah, much broader. I think the schools element is what will get people listening. I think the idea that there's a silent killer in schools with children will be very emotive. And I suppose that's a good thing if we're paying attention. But it's much broader. What's most shocking is that something that we were exposed to such a long time ago is now still, you're seeing the health effects and implications sort of coming to the surface now. So these people who in industries like, there's a statistic that about 20 tradespeople die each week as a result of past exposure. So for carpenters, people who have been working in building sites and those kind of environments, who maybe, took on a job in their 20s, they're now approaching their retirement that they've, put money away and saved for, and they're having to deal with these horrendous health consequences. And I think the most shocking thing, not only these numbers of the people who are dying a week as a result of past exposure, but the shocking thing is that, by the end of the 19th century, we knew that heavy exposure to asbestos carried the risk of life-threatening respiratory disease. And by the 1960s, it was, well within public knowledge that we knew about this. So it's quite shocking.
But it wasn't actually fully banned within the UK building industry until 1999.
Why?
It's a cheap option. The government and the industry basically turned a blind eye to it for a long time. It was major failings across the board.
And I guess, Jess, it's not just about institutions and governments that are using asbestos either. It's also about individuals listening to this now that have got asbestos in the roof of their shed or their garage or whatever, who haven't disposed of it properly or aren't looking after it correctly because they think, well, the building's lasted 50 years, I'll get another 30 out of it, then it'll be someone else's problem.
Yeah, I think that is a good point. I also think that one of the ways that we can potentially deal with this, aside from rebuilding or tearing down or rebuilding all of our schools, is to teach people how to identify asbestos and help them come up with ways to get it out of their house. But yeah, I think it's a lack of education on what it is and where it is that is one of the bigger problems.
And also managing. I mean, that was my point. Actually, if a building has asbestos, as I understand it, if it's managed correctly, it is safe. It becomes unsafe at the point that it becomes moved and destructed, right?
Yeah, I find the argument that it's safe unless it's disturbed particularly frustrating, especially in schools. Children are destructive human beings. So I think that that's a cop-out, I think.
It poses a much greater danger to younger people. Apparently, the lifetime risk of developing mesothelioma is 3.5 times greater for a child that's first exposed at age 5 compared to an adult who's exposed at age 25. So this is a huge risk to children in particular. And this is in a week also, this has emerged in the same week that a Guardian investigation found that death rates from this cancer are peaking. Basically, there are now for the past 5 years up to 2017, there have been about 2,500 deaths per year, which is nearly double the amount since 1995. The UK has the highest mesothelioma death rates in the world. So this is a major problem and it's a ticking time bomb for the future.
And that's it, isn't it? It is a long-term problem, Felicity, and we might be seeing the spikes now. But we know that school maintenance has been cut as a result of freezes to education budgets. I mean, if you're the government and you've got to put money for education, how popular would it be to say, well, we're going to close this school down for 2 years whilst we remove all the asbestos?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be popular at all. I think it's sort of out of sight, out of mind with all the challenges that schools are facing at the moment. I mean, you hear these schools that can't afford textbooks or simple basic stationery, or teachers having to man the school canteen because there aren't enough staff. So it's one of those things that because you can't really see it and it doesn't feel like it's a big problem compared to the more visible ones, I don't think it's going to get a lot of traction, even though it should be.
And something you can see towering over London still is Grenfell and the ashes of that. I know that was cladding, not asbestos, but what can we learn from how the government have dealt with Grenfell, Kari, that might be instructive here?
I mean, given that recent research found that of the dozens of tower blocks across the UK with the same cladding that they had in Grenfell, that less than 10 have actually been converted. What, are we 3 years now since the fire? I mean, that doesn't bode well. I think we need an actual organised effort in this. At the moment, you know, with Grenfell, there's the ongoing debate about who should foot the costs for this, whether it should be the building owners or the government or whatever. I think the government needs to implement a phased removal of all asbestos from schools, potentially from every workplace. This isn't going to be popular, as Felicity said. It's hugely expensive and you don't really have anything concrete, no pun intended, to show for it at the end. But the government needs to set up some sort of actual timetable and set aside some funding to deal with this, rather than just keep releasing reports or saying, well, we're funding schools.
Isn't it also to do with building regulations as a whole across the UK? And I think Grenfell has really illuminated just the myriad concerns and problems with how regulation is undertaken in this country, particularly third-party inspections which are open to abuse, conflicts of interest between developers and contracted inspectors. The more you look into the building regulations, how the buildings are built, and also, as you were saying, Kari, who is liable and who should take the blame, it's just an absolute mess. And you have all sorts of buildings, whether it's asbestos or the cladding. I mean, they're just being put up in such a shoddy way.
But the regulations are there. I mean, people working in the construction industry on an official basis know exactly what they're supposed to do. I suppose where there have been loopholes is sometimes with, you know, dodgy landlords trying to cut corners.
But I mean, the regulations are there, but from my understanding, they're extremely complex, and sometimes it's not always clear how they should be followed, what they mean. The whole thing has to be simplified. There has to be more clarity, and I don't think you've got that at the moment. I
mean, forgive me for turning to you for the transatlantic take, Jess, but I'm just curious, you know, in North America, it's such a litigious country. I don't know if you've got a situation like this with asbestos there, but if you did have this exact situation, people would be suing the builders that constructed the schools all over the shop, and that possibly, arguably, would tighten this up a lot quicker, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I think that that's exactly right. And I think, like was said earlier, it's because this is a problem in schools and it relates to our children, it's going to be much more effective. And I think that it's the parents that are going to have to stand up and say, this is a problem. I think actually I had an idea as I was researching this, which is to, aside from create sort of a self-reporting method and a sort of public database to see, is there asbestos in this school, it should be put into the Ofsted report for these schools. I think that that would really have an effect, and it would allow parents to say, I don't want to send my kids to a school that has asbestos in it.
And do you think once these stories die down, it's incumbent on everybody in the media to keep reporting it, Kari? Because that's the other part of this, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, at the moment, actually last week there was Action Mesothelioma Day. So there are campaigns.
That's not going to wash on the radio. It's hard to pronounce.
I know, I struggle with it every time.
Yeah, give me Bowel Cancer Week any day.
There does need to be greater publicity. The government needs to be more transparent about what's going on. It keeps promising to release a report on its findings into the situation in schools, but there's been no schedule set for that. So I think, as Jess was saying, the government needs to release the names of all the schools with asbestos and to introduce regulations so that schools have to say whether they do, because obviously otherwise why would they? It's not exactly going to be great publicity for them. But yes, it all needs to become transparent.
Right, Felicity, you're up next after this. OK, Felicity, your turn. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
The damaging footprint of the man who can't see the wood for the trees.
The rich greens of the most vibrant habitat on Earth. The billions of trees store so much carbon they help to slow down global warming. But the sight of bare earth and dead trunks is becoming more common, with huge tracts of forest wiped out. To bring these trees down to the ground, they just knocked them over with a bulldozer. This is happening all over the Amazon to create new farmland. And the result is that the Great Forest has never been under such pressure.
That was the BBC's David Shookman reporting last week from the Amazon. Felicity, what's the story this week?
The story this week is that deforestation in Brazil's portion of the Amazon rainforest
is continuing. It wasn't just last week.
It's not continuing. It's accelerated dramatically under Brazil's new president, Jair Bolsonaro. So it rose more than 88% in June compared with the same month a year ago. And the BBC have been doing a series all last week on the effects of his policies. And as you heard, the BBC estimates that it's the equivalent of a football pitch of rainforest is being destroyed every single minute.
And for people who think, well, that's a shame, but the Amazon's massive, why does this really matter?
The Amazon is massive, you are correct. Brazil is home to 60% of the Amazon. It's the world's largest tropical rainforest, and it's seen as vital in the global fight against climate change. And that's because the leaves of the trees absorbs huge quantities of carbon dioxide that otherwise would be floating around in the atmosphere and adding to a rise in global temperatures. I think this is absolutely incredible. It was sort of buried in an article I read, but by one recent estimate, the trees of the Amazon rainforest pulled in carbon dioxide equivalent to the fossil fuel emissions of most of the 9 countries that own or border the forest between 1980 to 2010.
Right.
So it's pretty important.
So the actual solution to climate change might be planting more trees.
Yes,
and instead they're deforesting it.
Yes, that is one part of the conversation. There was a report also released this week that has said that planting billions of trees across the world is by far the biggest and cheapest way to tackle climate crisis, which was the first calculation of how many more trees could be planted without encroaching on cropland or urban areas.
OK. And Felicity sort of mentioned the populist leader of Brazil there, Jess. To what extent does populism and deforestation go hand in hand? Why do they seem like natural bedfellows? Surely it's a populist policy to protect the planet as well.
So I think what populists are really good at doing is appealing to the sort of downtrodden everyman, right? So a lot of Brazil's working class are unemployed. And the main reason why they are deforesting is because they want to create new farmland, areas to mine. And so the idea is that this would create new jobs. And so the connection between this problem that a lot of people aren't really seeing the effects of now, of climate change, juxtaposed with the very real problem of being unemployed, I think people will always choose a job right now over a problem that might affect them in the future.
And I think it's to do with employment, but I also think it's to do with people's way of life. And I think what national populists do with climate change is they use it to rally their base against the so-called elite. You're seeing it not just in Brazil. So Australia is another really good example where you had Scott Morrison, who was elected this year, and it was kind of on a campaign of brandishing the opposition, Labour, as kind of urban snobs who, with their kind of perceived radical climate change policies, would deprive ordinary Australians of, their pickup trucks and their Sunday roast dinners and things that these people hold dear. So it's a climate change is a really, really effective tool for populist leaders.
Corey.
Yeah, and you had the same thing actually in the UK this week when David Attenborough was telling MPs that saving the environment would mean changing our diet and taking fewer flights. And, this immediately triggered a whole wave of right-wing criticism on Twitter with people saying, the working class are going to be priced out of travel and it's just the middle class will be able to continue to afford to enjoy it while preaching to us and making us feel guilty.
That is true, though, isn't it?
It is.
I mean, that would be the conclusion
extent,
of that.
And you can see how that argument has got twisted. But the point is, it's not about... This isn't a class war. This is everyone needs to do this. It's for the survival of humanity.
But the wealthy will always be able to afford it anyway. I mean, that's the
and you can see why that you can see why that triggers resentment. I mean, that's how in Brazil Bolsonaro came to power. He won power on the back of this populist agenda with the backing of agricultural businesses and small farmers. And you can understand from their point of view that you've got these rich countries who have deforested vast swaths of land in other parts of the world, now turning around to Brazil and saying, oh no, but you can't do that.
Okay, so that's developing countries. What's the parallel with Trump, though? I mean, Jess, you have a situation there where he has pulled the United States out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement. Again, a populist leader saying, no, I don't want to be part of fighting climate change in that cooperative way. Is it kind of nationalism versus internationalism?
Yeah, I do think there is a sort of America First aspect to Trump's message. I think he's very, very good at appealing to, again, the sort of the middle class everyman, right? So he did the same thing with coal country. He promised to, quote, bring back coal, which is not only a terrible environmental idea, it's also implausible, and it hasn't happened. And I actually find it a little bit encouraging. So recent polling suggests that more Americans actually want to cut down on coal usage. And even Republicans are a bit divided on the issue. A Pew survey from last April showed that 2/3 of Americans said they think that developing alternative energy sources is actually it should be a priority.
But we do need these countries to work together, don't we, Felicity, to find a global solution. That's the issue with populism.
I think that is essentially what it comes down to, is that tackling climate change requires a globalist response. And if you're a nationalist, that's anathema to you. That's not what you believe in. It's not why that's just not your core beliefs. I think that is the main problem, and I think it also goes back to this idea of, well, the Amazon is in our country, it's Brazilian, it's ours, we get to decide who makes the decisions. And obviously the pushback from the rest of the international community was, well, that's not true, because what happens to this rainforest affects all of us. And I think that's where you're seeing the real friction.
But I guess from that point of view, the argument would then be, okay, if it matters to everyone in the world, why doesn't the rest of the world contribute financially to Brazil to help support it? And then they wouldn't have to devastate it to make room for agriculture.
Absolutely, but also, I mean, it's a global demand for Brazilian beef. It's a global demand for Brazilian soya. So there is that. You can't get away from the hypocrisy, and that is managed by multinational companies. We are fueling the destruction. So yeah, it's the moralizing Greens who are back and forth saying you can't do this, but we'll still buy your beef.
And Trump earlier this year hosted Bolsonaro and said, we will look forward to increase in trade with Brazil. So I think that, certainly America is not doing its part to help with this at all.
Okay, who's up for a maths test?
Not
Silence.
me.
Huge excitement in the room. Okay, here it is. We can pause the recording for you whilst you work this out, if you like.
Can we use our phones?
You can use your phones.
Okay.
Yes, Kari, yes. If current trends continue, a football pitch of the rainforest disappearing every minute, right? What percentage of the rainforest will be lost during Bolsonaro's term in office?
Oh, bloody hell. Okay, so minutes. Okay,
we're saying 4 years?
Yeah. Just over 500,000 minutes in a year, is that correct? Times 4, say.
Well, 5 minutes has passed, thanks to the magic of podcasting. And what have we learned? There's been some frantic Googling.
Do you know what I think is actually more interesting that we've learned?
A Boris Johnson-esque swerve. Yeah, go on.
Is that there are currently about 3 trillion trees in the world, which is about half the number that existed before the rise of human civilization, which equates to a net loss of about 10 billion trees a year.
Okay.
I.e., we don't know the answer to your
We
question.
don't really know the answer.
It's hard to equate percentage-wise the size of a football pitch to the size of a rainforest, which is why these statistics are difficult for people to comprehend, I think. It's hard to understand how big the problem is or how comparatively insignificant the
No, a
problem is.
football pitch a minute. I think
Yes, that's large,
that's
but we
pretty
don't.
big.
Yeah, but
But do you know what I think is really effective is the imagery. So if you see the above head satellite imagery, it can be quite shocking. But one thing I read actually is that the government is trying to alter the imagery that's suspected that they are so that it looks less shocking. And so there are some groups that are actually trying to investigate this and show the real imagery. But I think that it is very difficult for people to grasp, and seeing it helps them do that.
One last story to come after this. And so, finally this week, it's Jessica. What do you think this week will be remembered for?
It's a boy. It's a girl. It's a disaster.
Newly released video shows the moment a gender reveal party went terribly wrong. A Border Patrol agent and his wife shot a rifle at a target. Blue smoke means it's a boy. Then this happened. The blaze quickly spread, reaching the Coronado National Forest in Arizona, destroying more than 45,000 acres of land and racking up more than $8 million in damages.
That was Inside Edition reporting back in November on a gender reveal announcement that went terribly wrong. Jessica, why do you want to bring this to our attention this week?
So the news this week is that there was yet another video released to the public, this one from Australia, and this one of an equally bad, well, maybe not equally, but quite bad gender reveal event.
What is a gender reveal event anyway?
So the idea is that you ask the doctor to find out the sex of your baby, write it down, and you give that piece of paper to a relative or someone else and ask them to reveal the sex of your baby in an extravagant way. So sometimes this can be through cutting a cake and it reveals either pink or blue. In more outrageous ways and destructive ways, some people are blowing things up and the smoke is revealing pink or blue. So these things get even more ridiculous and performative and dangerous.
And so the one that happened in Australia this week that you're referring to was, I didn't know this was a thing, but apparently this is a thing. You can put blue or pink smoke, depending on which gender it is, into the exhaust of your car and then reveal the baby's gender that way. But it went terribly wrong. And
yeah, the car caught fire.
I mean, the video footage looks like one of the baddies in Batman has somehow taken vengeance.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, it's ridiculous. I think that these, like I said, they're becoming more and more over the top. And I don't think people should be denied the right to celebrate something that's exciting about their child. But I think we have to wonder about why we're doing this. I would be curious to know if these would exist if social media did not exist. And I bet the answer is absolutely no. I think the reason why these have become such a thing is because people like to perform and they like to get likes on their Instagram and on Facebook.
Yeah, that's true, isn't it, Kari? If people were just not sharing this information with the wider world, if it was just their mother-in-law baking a cake or popping a balloon, that would be enough, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I have to say, I find it all. I mean, you can argue, yes, that it's a great way to celebrate and it's a nice excuse for a party, especially if you've struggled to conceive. You know, it is nice to sort of declare that to the world. But it does annoy me. It's just this, attention seeking, this whole look at me mentality and one-upmanship and, you know, who can go one step further. And it's almost as though it's actually got nothing to do with the child. It's just about this whole, you know, getting your likes, maybe another gift grab. I find it
gift
irritating.
grab. She went there. Is it that cynical? Jess is nodding as well.
There's a huge industry in this. People are spending ridiculous amounts of money.
So it's like the pre-baby shower, isn't it? So before the baby even exists.
Yeah, that's
or is
right.
about to exist.
It's sort of like granted, 9 months is a long time, right? And you want to celebrate your child as much as you can, and it's okay to be excited about it. But yeah, for family and friends, it can become increasingly expensive to fly across the country or wherever to join you for a gender reveal party, and then a baby shower, and then the birth, and then subsequent birthdays.
I think it's not only the profiteering aspect, which is undoubtedly a component in this, and it's quite nauseating, actually. And I think Dolly Alderton writes really well on things like hen do's and gender reveal parties. She's so witty and really cutting about them. And especially if you can't have children or don't have children, the ways they can make you feel quite isolated is a real thing. But I think it's more than that. Is it not kind of taking a step backwards in how we think about gender, and the idea that blue for a boy and pink for a girl, this very binary constructs. I thought that we were kind of getting away from that, and
it feels aggressive, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. I think it does feel slightly aggressive and kind of unnecessarily so. And also, there's a huge rise in this country of young people changing their gender anyway.
Yeah, but hold on. When you go for your ultrasound, and if you choose to have that information that's revealed to you, it doesn't make a comment on your position on gender fluidity when the child is born as to whether or not in the womb they either do or do not appear to be presenting a penis.
But is it not all this, pink glitter for a girl and explosives
Yeah, sure.
guns for a boy?
But imagine if it just said boy or
reductive.
girl, if it was just the word. I appreciate what you're saying, blue and pink, that's a separate conversation.
It's not just that, though. It's not just boy or girl. It's this whole kind of industry that's built around it.
For example, some of the themes are bows or bow ties. So bows, very pretty. Bow ties, business, success. Guns or glitter. That's surely one from the States.
Mermaids v pirates.
Yeah, what are we saying to our children when we assign them these themes at the very earliest point before they've even been born? I think it's an overemphasis.
Actually, when are you supposed to? Because the baby shower is also before the baby's born, isn't it?
The baby shower can be, in the 3 months leading up to the birth. So it's much further down the line. I think the gender reveal tends to be sort of 3 months, 4 months after you've found out.
So at the point you can find out.
It's not really a gender reveal, is it? It's a sex reveal.
Absolutely.
It's completely mislabeled.
Yeah.
It's a misnomer.
But people are doing it. Why? You're saying, it's terribly regressive and it's hideously exploitative and it's dangerous and it's me. But they're growing in popularity. So the trend appears to be that people like those things, despite what we think about them.
I think one of the main drivers is because everybody else is doing it, right? So it's all over social media. You go to Pinterest, and if you even slightly suggest to Pinterest by clicking on an image of a nursery design, you are served up all these other fancy examples of ways to celebrate your baby or ideas for a gender reveal. And I think there's a sense of sort of competition, and it's being built into the ritual of having a baby. So it feels like if you don't do this thing, that you aren't part of that ritual.
That you don't care, maybe. I think it also ties into this whole trend of making every previously private event of parenthood public. Kids just have, it's now your child's going to have a digital footprint before it's even born. It's going to have a bump print. There is no limit. Everything has to be done in the public face, or it's like it never happened.
And I am sensitive to what you're saying, especially about people who can't have children or for whatever reason have had some trauma around that, then being exposed to this on social media as well. But the flip side of that maybe is that there's actually a reassuring thing for couples that are expecting a baby when it is hard to think, oh, well, here's a milestone that's coming up that I can look forward to. My friends have just done this. That'll be us in a month's time. Let's keep trying to get through this bit.
If that's your reason for having a child, I'd find that slightly worrying.
That wouldn't be your reason for having a child, but a way of coping through the stresses of pregnancy.
But does that not just put more pressure on you? Oh, look, they've succeeded. They've done it.
I think that's a valid point, but I do think that there's a good reason to find out the sex of your baby. There have been studies that show that men, in particular fathers, sometimes it's harder for them to bond with their child than it is for a mother. You know, you're carrying the baby as a mother, you feel it all the time. And studies have shown that actually finding out the sex of your baby helps fathers to bond with their child before the baby's born. So I think
I don't understand that. I read that and I don't understand how that is the case at all. Why would it mean you would bond?
Visualize? It makes it seem more of a person.
I don't know why it's the case, but but that's what the science says. So I think that there can be benefits to it. I think it's the sort of performative aspect of it that I find a little bit troubling.
That's the thing. You don't need, I don't have any, we found out the gender of our kids before they were born. I don't have any problem with that. It's just the whole public, the publicity of look, the whole world must want to know. Your friends and family, of course, sure they do, but I don't think the rest of the world cares.
Yeah, it's very, very cheap and tacky. My child that's coming next month is a boy. That is it from this edition of The Week Unwrapped. My thanks to Jessica Hullinger, Felicity Capon and Kari Wilkin. Save us the trouble of having an elaborate firework display every Friday when we drop a new episode. Reveal by subscribing for free at theweekunwrapped.com or on your podcast app of choice. I've been Olly Mann. Our music is by Tom Morby, the producer Matt Hill at Rethink Audio. Until we meet again to unwrap next week. Bye-bye.